Chapter 4. Beatrice. At the end of the holidays, without having seen my friend again, I went to St. Both. My parents came with me, and, with every possible care, entrusted me to the protection of a boy's pension with a teacher at the gymnasium. They would have froze in horror if they had known what sort of things they were letting me wander into. The question was whether, with time, I could become a good son and a useful citizen, and whether my nature tended in other directions. My last attempt to be happy in the shadow of my father's house and spirit had lasted a long time, had almost succeeded at times, and finally failed completely. The strange emptiness and loneliness I felt during the holidays after my confirmation felt for the first time. How did I get to know it later? This emptiness, this thin air, did not pass so quickly. Saying goodbye to home was extraordinarily easy. I was actually ashamed that I wasn't more wistful. The sisters cried for no reason. I couldn't. I was amazed at myself. I've always been a sentimental kid and basically a pretty good kid. Now I was completely transformed. I behaved completely indifferent to the outside world, and for days I was only occupied with listening to myself and listening to the streams, the forbidden and dark streams that were rushing underground inside me. I had grown very quickly, only in the last 6 months, and looked tall, thin, and incomplete at the world. The boy's kindness had left me altogether. I felt myself that one could not love me like that, and I did not love myself at all. I often had a great longing for Demian, but not infrequently I hated him too, and blamed him for the impoverishment of my life, which I accepted like an ugly disease. At first I was neither loved nor respected in our boarding school. I was teased at first. Then they pulled away from me, seeing me as a dodger and a nasty oddball. I liked the role, even exaggerated it, and rolled myself into a loneliness that on the outside constantly looked like manly contempt for the world, while secretly I often succumbed to consuming fits of melancholy and despair. At school I had accumulated knowledge from home to draw from. The class was a little behind my previous one, and I had come to regard my peers as children with some contempt. It went on like this for a year or more, and even the first holiday visits at home didn't bring any new sounds. It was like going away again. It was early November. I had gotten into the habit of taking short reflective walks in all weathers, during which I often enjoyed a kind of bliss, a bliss filled with melancholy, worldly contempt, and self-loathing. So one evening in the damp misty twilight I strolled through the outskirts of the city. The wide avenue of a public park was completely deserted and invited me. The path was thick with fallen leaves, in which I rooted with dark lust with my feet. It smelled damp and bitter. The distant trees emerged from the mists, spooky and shadowy. At the end of the avenue I stood irresolutely, staring at the black foliage and greedily breathing in the wet scent of weathering and dying, which something within me responded and welcomed. Oh, how bland life tasted. A man in a billowing collared coat came out of a side road. I wanted to go on when he called me. "Hello, Sinclair." He approached. It was Alphonse Beck, the oldest of our pension. I always liked seeing him and had nothing against him, except that he was always ironic and avuncular with me, as with all the younger ones. He was considered strong as an ox, was supposed to have the gentleman of our pension under his slipper, and was the hero of many high school rumors. "What are you doing here?" he called out affably, in the tone the older ones used when they occasionally deigned to join one of us. "Well, we bet you make poetry." "I can't think of one," I declined harshly. He laughed and walked beside me, chatting in a way I was not used to. "You don't need to be afraid, Sinclair. I don't understand that. There's something about walking in the fog in the evening with autumn thoughts. You like to write poems, I know. Of dying nature, of course, and of the lost youth that it resembles. See Heinrich Heine." "I'm not that sentimental," I protested. "Well, let it be. But in this weather, it seems to me, it's good for people to find a quiet place to have a glass of wine or something. Will you come with me for a bit? I'm all alone right now. Or don't you like? I don't want to be your seducer, dear, if you should be a model boy." Soon we were sitting in a small suburban bar, drinking some dubious wine and toasting our thick glasses. I didn't like it much at first. At least it was something new. But soon, unaccustomed to wine, I became very talkative. It was as if a window had opened in me. The world shone in. how terribly long I hadn't gotten anything off my chest. I started fantasizing, and in the middle of it I was telling the story of Cain and Abel. Beck listened to me with pleasure. At last, someone I gave something to. He slapped me on the shoulder. He called me a devil of a man and a bitch of a genius, and my heart swelled with delight at letting pent-up needs of speech and communication pour out voluptuously, to be recognized and to count for something with an older man. When he called me a bitch of a genius, the word ran into my soul like a sweet, strong wine. The world burned in new colors. Thoughts flowed to me from 100-bold sources. Spirit and fire blazed within me. We talked about teachers and comrades, and it seemed to me that we understood each other wonderfully. We talked about the Greeks and paganism, and Beck was quite willing to get me to confess about amorous adventures. I couldn't have a say in that. I had experienced nothing to tell, and what I felt inside me, constructed, had fantasized, that was burning inside me, but the wine hadn't solved it and made it communicable. Beck knew a lot more about the girls, and I listened ardently to these fairy tales. I experienced unbelievable things there. Things that had never been thought possible became flat reality, seemed self-evident. Alphonse Beck had already gained experience at the age of 18. Among other things, that there was such a thing with the girls. They wanted nothing but to pretend and have gallantries, and that was very pretty, but not the real thing. There is hope for more success with women. Women are much smarter. For example, Frau Jegelt, who ran the shop with exercise books and pencils. She was easy to talk to, and everything that had happened behind her counter would not go into a book. I sat deeply charmed and dazed. Admittedly, I couldn't have loved Frau Jegelt, but still it was outrageous. Spring seemed to flow there, at least for the older ones, which I had never dreamed of. There was a false sound to it, and everything tasted less and more commonplace than love should taste in my opinion, but all the same, it was reality, it was life and adventure. There was someone sitting next to me who had experienced it. The one who had it seemed natural. Our conversations had descended a little, had lost something. I wasn't that brilliant little guy anymore either. I was now just a boy listening to a man. But even so, against what has been going on for months and months my life had been, this was delicious. This was paradise. Besides, as I was only beginning to feel, it was forbidden, very forbidden, from sitting in this tavern to what we talked about. In any case, I tasted spirit, tasted revolution in it. I remember that night with the greatest clarity, when we both made our way home late in the cool, wet night, past dimly burning gas lanterns. I was drunk for the first time. It wasn't pretty, it was extremely painful, and yet it still had something, a charm, a sweetness. It was rebellion and orgy. It was life and spirit. Beck took care of me bravely, though he scolded me bitterly for being a beginner, and half carried me home, where he managed to smuggle me and himself in through an open hall window. But with the disillusionment to which I awoke in pain after a very short dead sleep, a senseless pang of pain came over me. I sat up in bed, still wearing my day shirt, my clothes and shoes lying on the floor and smelling of tobacco and vomit, and in between headaches, nausea and raging thirst, an image came to my mind that I hadn't had for a long time, had looked in the eye. I saw home and parents' house, father and mother, sisters and garden. I saw my quiet bedroom at home, saw the school and the marketplace, saw Demian and the confirmation hours, and all this was light. Everything was surrounded by splendor. Everything was wonderful, divine, and pure, and everything that had, so I now knew, only yesterday, hours ago, belonged to me, was waiting for me, and now, only now, in this hour, had sunk and cursed, no longer belonged to me, pushed me, looked at me with disgust. All the love and affection that I had ever received from my parents, even in the most distant golden gardens of my childhood, every kiss from my mother, every Christmas, every bright, pious Sunday morning at home, every flower in the garden, everything was devastated. I had trampled on everything. So this is what I looked like inside. I who went about despising the world. I who was proud in spirit and thoughts along with Demian's thoughts. This is what I looked like. A sputum and hedgehog, drunkard, filthy, loathsome and vile, a savage beast overwhelmed by hideous impulses. This is how I looked. I came home from those gardens where everything was purity, splendor, and sweet tenderness. I, who had loved music by Bach and beautiful poems, with disgust and indignation I heard my own laughter, a drunken, uncontrolled laughter that broke out in fits and starts. That was me. In spite of everything, it was almost a pleasure to suffer these torments. I had crawled blind and dull for so long, my heart had been silent and sat impoverished in a corner for so long that even this self-accusation, this horror, this whole dreadful feeling of the soul was welcome. It was feeling, after all. Flames rose up, heart twitched in it. Confused, I felt something like liberation, and sprung in the midst of misery. In the meantime, seen from the outside, things were going downhill for me. The first intoxication was soon no longer the first. There was a lot of drinking and alotria at our school. I was one of the very youngest among those who took part, and soon I was no longer a tolerated child, but a leader and star, a famous, daring one-pub goer. Once again I belonged entirely to the dark world, to the devil, and I was considered a splendid fellow in this world. At the same time, I felt miserable. I lived in a self-destructive orgia, and while I thought by my comrades to be a leader and a headshot, a damned dashing and witty fellow, I had an anxious soul fluttering with anxiety deep within me. I remember tears coming to my eyes as I left a pub on a Sunday morning and saw children playing in the street, bright and happy with their hair freshly combed and their Sunday clothes. And while I amused and often frightened my friends with unheard-of cynicism, between pools of beer at dirty tables in small inns, I had a hidden heart of reverence for everything I scorned, and inwardly I lay on my knees, weeping for my soul, for my past, before my mother, before God. There was a reason why I never became one with my companions, that I remained lonely among them, and was therefore able to suffer so much. I was a tavern hero and a mocker after the heart of the rudest. I showed wit and showed courage in my thoughts and speeches about teachers, school, parents, church. I also stood up to dirty talk and even dared one myself, but I was never there when my buddies went to girls. I was alone and was full of ardent longing for love, hopeless longing, while I should have been a hardened epicure after my speeches. No one was more vulnerable. No one was more bashful than me, and whenever I saw the young bourgeois girls walking ahead of me, pretty and clean, light and graceful, they were wonderful, pure dreams to me, 1,000 times too good and pure for me. For a while I couldn't go to Frau Jagelt's paper shop because I blushed when I looked at her and thought of what Alphonse Beck had told me about her. The more I knew that I was constantly lonely and different in my new society, the less I could break away from it. I really don't remember whether drinking and boasting ever gave me any pleasure, nor did I ever get used to drinking that I didn't feel embarrassing consequences every time. It was all like a compulsion. I did what I had to do because otherwise I had no idea what to start with. I was afraid of being alone for a long time, afraid of the many tender, bashful, intimate impulses to which I always felt inclined, afraid of the tender thoughts of love that often came to me. I missed one thing the most, a friend. There were 2 or 3 classmates that I really liked to see, but they were among the brave, and my vices were no longer a secret to anyone. They avoided me. Everyone saw me as a hopeless player, with the ground shaking under my feet. The teachers knew a lot about me. I had been severely punished several times. My eventual dismissal from the school was something to be expected. I knew that myself. I hadn't been a good student for a long time, but pushed and dangled my way through with difficulty, with the feeling that it couldn't last much longer. There are many ways in which God can lonely us and lead us to ourselves. He walked this path with me at the time. It was like a bad dream, across dirt and stickiness, across broken beer glasses and cynical nights of chatter. I see myself crawling, a spellbound dreamer, restless and tormented, in an ugly and unclean way. There are such dreams in which, on the way to the princess, one gets stuck in puddles of feces, in back alleys full of stench and filth. That is how I felt. In this not very subtle way, I was destined to become lonely and to bring between me and childhood a closed Eden gate with mercilessly beaming guardians. It was a beginning, an awakening of homesickness for myself. I was still frightened and had convulsions when, alarmed by letters from my pensioner, my father appeared in St. for the first time and unexpectedly confronted me. When, toward the end of that winter, he came for the second time, I was already harsh and indifferent. I let him scold, let him plead, let him remind me of my mother. He was very upset at the end and said that if I didn't change, he would have kicked me out of school with shame, and shame would put me into a reform school. That's what he wants. I felt sorry for him when he left, but he hadn't achieved anything. He hadn't found a way to get to me, and for a moment I felt that he was being served right. I didn't care what would become of me. In my strange and not very pretty way, with my tavern sitting and boasting, I was at odds with the world. This was my form of protest. I broke myself doing it, and sometimes things looked something like this to me. If the world didn't need people like me, if it didn't have a better place for them, no higher tasks, then people like me just broke down. May the world have the harm. The Christmas holidays of that year were quite unpleasant. My mother was shocked when she saw me again. I had grown even more, and my gaunt face looked gray and wasted, with slack features and inflamed eye rims. The first hint of the mustache and the glasses I'd been wearing made me even more of a stranger to her. The sisters backed away and giggled. It was all unsavory. The conversation with my father in his study was uninvigorating and bitter, greeting the few relatives uninvigorating, and Christmas Eve especially uninvigorating. Ever since I was alive, that had been the big day in our house, the evening of celebration and love, of gratitude, of the renewal of the bond between my parents and me. This first time everything was just depressing and embarrassing. As usual, my father read the gospel from the shepherds in the field. They kept watch over their flock there. As usual, the sisters stood beaming in front of their gift table, but the father's voice sounded unhappy, and his face looked old and cramped, and mother was sad, and everything was equally embarrassing and unwanted for me. Gifts and congratulations, gospel and tree of lights. The gingerbread smelt sweet and gave off dense clouds of sweeter memories. The fir tree smelled and told of things that were no longer there. I longed for the end of the evening and the holidays. It went on like this all winter. Only recently I'd received an urgent warning from the teachers' senate and was threatened with expulsion. It wouldn't be long now. Well, fine with me. I had a special grudge against Max Demian. I hadn't seen him all this time. At the beginning of my school days in St., I had written him twice, but received no answer. That's why I hadn't visited him during the holidays either. In the same park where I met Alphonse Beck in the autumn, it happened in the early part of the year, spring, just as the thorn hedges were beginning to turn green, that a girl caught my eye. I'd gone for walks alone, full of disgusting thoughts and worries, for my health had deteriorated, and besides I was constantly in financial difficulties, owed money to friends, had to invent necessary expenses to get something from home again, and had several shops adding up bills for cigars and things like that. Not that these worries went very deep, but when my stay here came to an end and I went into the water or was taken to the reform school, then these few little things never mattered. But I always lived face to face with such unsightly things and suffered from them. On that spring day in the park I met a young lady who attracted me greatly. She was tall and slender, elegantly dressed, and had an intelligent, boyish face. I liked her immediately. She was the type I loved, and she began to occupy my fantasies. She was hardly much older than me, but much more mature, elegant and well-formed, almost a lady already, but with a touch of cockiness and boyishness on my face, which I was very fond of. I'd never been able to get close to a girl I was in love with, and I wasn't able to with this one either, but the impression was deeper than any previous one, and the impact of this infatuation on my life was tremendous. Suddenly I had a picture before me again, a high and revered picture. Oh, and no need, no urge so deep and violent in me as the desire for reverence and worship. I gave her the name Beatrice because I knew about her from an English painting, without having read Dante, and I had kept a reproduction of it. There it was, an English pre-Raphaelite girl figure, very long-limbed and slender, with a long narrow head and spiritualized hands and features. My beautiful young girl was not quite like her, though she too had that slenderness and boyishness of forms I loved, and something of that spirituality or animation of the face. I haven't spoken a single word to Beatrice, yet it was then that she exercised the deepest influence on me. She placed her image in front of me. She opened a sanctuary to me. She made me to pray in a temple. From one day to the next I stayed away from the pubs and nocturnal forays. I could be alone again. I liked to read again. I liked to go for walks again. The sudden conversation earned me enough ridicule, but now I had something to love and worship. I had an ideal again. Life was full of foreboding and colorful, mysterious twilight. That made me insensitive. I was home and with myself again, albeit only as a slave and servant of a worshipped image. I cannot think of that time without a certain emotion. Again I tried with the deepest effort to build myself a light world from the rubble of a collapsed period of my life. Again I lived completely in the single desire to ditch the dark and evil in me, and stay completely in the light on my knees before the gods. After all, this current bright world was to some extent my own creation. It was no longer a fleeing and crawling under my mother and irresponsible security. It was a new service that I invented and demanded myself, with responsibility and self-discipline. The sexuality I suffered from and before which I was always and always on the run should now be transfigured into spirit and devotion into this holy fire. There was to be nothing dark, nothing ugly, no moaning through the night, no heart-pounding in front of lewd images, no eavesdropping on forbidden doors, no lasciviousness. Instead of all this, I set up my altar with the image of Beatrice, and in consecrating myself to her, I consecrated myself to the spirit and the gods. I sacrificed the light of the portion of my life that I stole from the dark powers. My goal was not lust, but purity, not happiness, but beauty and spirituality. This cult of Beatrice changed my life completely. Yesterday, a precocious cynic, now I was a temple servant aiming at becoming a saint. Not only did I dismiss the miserable life to which I had become accustomed, I sought to change everything, sought to bring purity, nobility, and dignity into everything, thought of this in food and drink, speech and dress. I began the morning with cold washes, which at first I had to force myself to do. I behaved gravely and with dignity, carried myself upright and slowed my walk with dignity. It may have looked funny to onlookers. For me, it was all worship. Of all the new exercise in which I sought to express my new attitude, one became important to me. I started painting. It started with the fact that the English picture of Beatrice I owned didn't resemble the girl enough. I wanted to try and paint them for myself. With a whole new joy and hope, I gathered beautiful paper, paints, and brushes in my room (I recently had my own), and prepared my palette, glass, china bowls, and pencils. I was delighted with the fine tempera paints in small tubes that I had bought. There was a fiery chromium oxide green, which I still think I can see when it first lit up in the small white bowl. I started with caution. Painting a face was difficult. I wanted to try something else first. I painted ornaments, flowers, and fantasized landscapes, a tree by a chapel, a Roman bridge with cypresses. Sometimes I lost myself completely in this playful activity, was happy like a child with a box of paints. Eventually, however, I began to paint Beatrice. Some sheets failed altogether and were discarded. The more I tried to imagine the face of the girl I ever met on the street, the less she wanted to leave. In the end, I gave up and simply began to paint a face, following the imagination and the guidance that resulted from what I had started, from paint and brush. It was a dreamy face that came out, and I wasn't dissatisfied with it, but I immediately continued the experiment, and each new sheet spoke a little more clearly, came closer to the type, even if by no means to reality. I got more and more used to drawing lines with dreamy brush and filling in areas that were without precedent. That resulted from playful touching, from the unconscious. Finally, one day, almost unconscious, I finished a face that spoke to me more strongly than the previous ones. It wasn't that girl's face, nor was it meant to be. It was something different, something unreal but no less valuable. It looked more like a boy's head than a girl's face. The hair was not light blonde like my pretty girl's, but brown with a reddish tinge. The chin was strong and firm, but the mouth was blooming red. The whole thing somewhat stiff and mask-like, but impressive and full of secret life. As I sat in front of the finished sheet, it gave me a strange impression. It seemed to me some kind of idol or sacred mask, half male, half female, ageless, as strong-willed as dreamy, as rigid as secretly alive. This face had something to say to me. It belonged to me. It made demands on me. And it looked like someone. I didn't know who. The image accompanied all my thoughts for a while and shared my life. I kept it hidden in a drawer so no one could get a hold of it and taunt me with it. But as soon as I was alone in my little room, I pulled out the picture and had company with it. In the evenings I pinned it to the wallpaper across from me over the bed, and looked at it until I fell asleep. In the morning I saw it first. Just at that time I started dreaming a lot again, as I had always done as a child. It seemed to me that I hadn't had any dreams for years. Now they came back, a whole new kind of pictures, and often the painted portrait appeared in them, living and talking, my friend or enemy, sometimes pulled into a grimace and sometimes infinitely beautiful, harmonious and noble. And one morning, waking up from such dreams, I suddenly realized it. It looked at me so fabulously familiar. It seemed to be calling my name. It seemed to know me like a mother, seemed devoted to me from all time. I stared at the paper with my heart pounding, the thick brown hair, the half-feminine mouth, the strong forehead with a strange lightness. It had dried up by itself, and I felt the recognition, the rediscovery, the knowledge closer and closer within me. I jumped out of bed, stood up in front of the face, and looked at it closely, straight into the wide-open greenish staring eyes, the right one of which stood a little higher than the other, and suddenly that right eye twitched slightly and delicately, but clearly, and with this twitch I recognized the picture. How could I have found that so late? It was Demian's face. Later I compared the sheet over and over again with Demian's real features as I found them in my memory. They weren't the same at all, although similar, but it was Demian. Once on an early summer evening the sun shone slantingly and red through my west-facing window. It was getting dark in the room. Then I had the idea of pinning Beatrice's or Demian's portrait to the cross of the window with a pin and looking at it with the evening sun shining through. The face blurred without outlines, but the reddish-rimmed eyes, the brightness on the forehead, and the intensely red mouth glowed deeply and wildly from the surface. I ran across from it for a long time, even after it had gone out, and gradually I got the feeling that it wasn't Beatrice and not Demian, but myself. The picture didn't resemble me. It shouldn't, I felt. But it was what made my life. It was my inner being, my destiny or my demon. This is what my boyfriend would look like if I ever found one again. This is what my lover would look like if I ever had one. Such would be my life and such would be my death. Such was the sound and rhythm of my destiny. In those weeks I'd begun reading that made a deeper impression on me than anything I'd read before. Even later I rarely experienced more books like this, maybe only Nietzsche. It was a volume of novellas, with letters and sentences, many of which I did not understand, and yet all of which attracted and embraced me unspeakably. One of the sayings came to mind now. I wrote it with a pen under the portrait. Destiny and mind are names of one concept. I understood that now. I often saw the girl I called Beatrice. I no longer felt any movement, but always a gentle agreement, an emotional anticipation. You are connected to me, but not you, only your image. You are a piece of my destiny. A longing for Max Demian became powerful again. I knew nothing about him, nothing for years. I met him only once during the holidays. I see now that I omitted this brief encounter from my notes, and see that it was out of shame and vanity. I have to make up for it. So once during the holidays, when I was strolling through my native town with the blasé and always somewhat tired face of my time at the inn, swinging my walking stick and looking at the old unchanged despised faces of the Philistines, my former friend came towards me. As soon as I saw him I winced, and in a flash I had to think of Franz Cromer. Would that Demian really have forgotten this story? It was so awkward having that obligation to him. A silly kid story, really, but an obligation nonetheless. He seemed to be waiting for me to greet him, and when I did it as casually as possible, he shook my hand. That was his handshake again, so firm, warm yet cool, manly. He looked at me intently in the face and said, "You've grown up, Sinclair." He himself seemed quite the same to me, the same age, the same young as ever. He joined me, we went for a walk and talked about all sorts of side things, nothing from back then. It occurred to me that I had once written to him several times without getting a reply. Ah, if only I had forgotten that too, those stupid, stupid letters. He said nothing about it. At that time there was no Beatrice and no portrait. I was still in the middle of my wild days. Outside the city I invited him to come with me to an inn. He went with me. I boastfully ordered a bottle of wine, poured it, clinked glasses with it, and showed that I was very familiar with student drinking habits, and emptied the first glass in one gulp. "You go to the tavern a lot?" he asked me. "Oh yes," I said lazily. "What else is there to do?" It still ends up being the funniest thing. Do you find, it may be, something about it is very beautiful, the intoxication, the bachic. But I think most of the people who sit in the tavern a lot have lost that altogether. It seems to me that running around in a pub is something really Philistine. Yes, one long night with burning torches to a real, beautiful intoxication and ecstasy. But like that again and again, one scoop after the other, that's probably not the truth, is it? Can you imagine Faust sitting at a regular's table night after night? I drank and gave him a hostile look. Yeah, not everyone is Faust, I said shortly. He looked at me a little suspiciously. Then he laughed with the old freshness and superiority. Well, what's the point of arguing about it? In any case, the life of a drunkard or libertine is probably livelier than that of the blameless citizen. And then, I read that once, the life of the libertine is one of the best preparations for the mystic. It's always people like St. Augustine who become seers. Before that he was also a bon vivant. I was suspicious and didn't want to let him master me, so I said smugly, yes, to each his own taste. To be honest, I'm not interested in becoming a seer or anything like that. Demian flashed knowingly at me from slightly narrowed eyes. Dear Sinclair, he said slowly, I had no intention of saying anything unpleasant to you. By the way, for what purpose do you drink your pints now? Neither of us know. That in you, what makes your life, already knows it. It's so good to know that there is someone inside us who knows everything, wants everything, does everything better than we do ourselves. But forgive me, I have to go home. We said goodbye. I sat there in a very grumpy mood, drank my bottle completely, and found as I was about to leave that Demian had already paid for it. That annoyed me even more. At this little incident my thoughts stopped again. They were full of Demian, and the words he said in that inn outside the city came back to me, strangely fresh and undisturbed. It is good to know that there is someone within us who knows everything. I looked at the picture that hung on the window and was completely gone, but I saw the eyes still glow. That was Demian's gaze, or it was the one that was inside me, the one who knows everything. How I longed for Demian. I didn't know anything about him, I couldn't reach him. All I knew that he was probably studying somewhere, and that after he finished high school his mother left our town. Back to my story with Cromer, I searched out all the memories of Max Demian in me. How much resounded there that he had once said to me, and everything still made sense today, was relevant, concerned me. What he had said about the libertine and the saint at our last so unpleasant meeting suddenly stood out brightly in my mind. Wasn't that how it happened to me? Hadn't I lived in intoxication and filth, in numbness and forlornness, until just the opposite came to life in me with a new urge to live, the desire for purity, the longing for the sacred? So I continued to follow the memories. Night had long since fallen, and it was raining outside. I also heard it rain in my memories. It was the hour under the chestnut trees when he once questioned me about Franz Cromer and guessed my first secrets. One after the other came up, conversations on the way to school, the confirmation classes, and finally my very first meeting with Max Demian came to mind. What was that about? I didn't think of it right away, but I took my time. I was totally absorbed in it. And now it came back, that too. We were stood in front of our house and telling me what he thought of Cain. He had spoken of the old blurred coat of arms that sat above our house gate, in the keystone that got wider from bottom to top. He had said it was of interest to him, and one had to watch out for such things. That night I dreamed of Demian and the coat of arms. It was constantly changing. Demian held it in his hands. It was often small and gray, often huge and multicolored, but he explained to me that it was always one and the same. But at last he forced me to eat the coat of arms. When I had swallowed it, I felt with tremendous terror that the devoured heraldic bird was alive in me, filling me and beginning to consume me from within. Full of the fear of death, I startled and woke up. I woke up, it was the middle of the night, and heard it raining in the room. I got up to close the window and stepped on something light on the floor. In the morning I found it was my painted sheet. It lay on the ground in the wet and had thrown itself into bulges. I stretched it between flow sheets and a heavy book to dry, as when I looked at it again the next day, it was dried. But it had changed. The red mouth had faded and narrowed a little. It was now entirely Demian's mouth. I now set about painting a new page, the heraldic bird. I no longer remembered what it actually looked like, and I knew that some of it was no longer easy to make out, even up close, but the thing was old and had been painted over many times. The bird was standing or sitting on something, maybe on a flower or on a basket or nest or on a treetop. I ignored it and started with what I had a clear idea of. Out of an unclear need, I immediately started with strong colors. The bird's head was golden yellow on my paper. I continued on with my mood and finished the thing in a few days. Now it was a bird of prey, with a sharp, bold hawk's head. He stuck half his body in a dark globe, from which he worked his way up as if from a gigantic egg, on a blue sky background. As I looked longer at the sheet, it seemed to me more and more as if it were the colored coat of arms as it had appeared in my dream. It would not have been possible for me to write a letter to Demian, even if I had known where to go, but I decided, in the same dreamy ancestor with whom I did everything at the same time, to send him the picture of the sparrowhawk, whether it would reach him or not. I didn't write anything on it, not even my name, trimmed the edges carefully, bought a large paper envelope, and wrote my friend's former address on it, and then sent it away. An exam was approaching, and I had to work more than usual for the school. The teachers had taken me back to their mercy since I had suddenly changed my despicable ways. I probably wasn't a good student even now, but neither I nor anyone else thought about the fact that 6 months ago my dismissal from the school as a punishment had seemed likely to everyone. My father wrote to me in the same tone as before, without reproaches or threats, but I had no desire to explain to him or anyone how the change had happened to me. It was a coincidence that this change coincided with the wishes of my parents and teachers. This change didn't bring me closer to anyone, it just made me lonelier. It aimed somewhere, at Demian, at a distant fate. I didn't know it myself, I was right in the middle of it. It had started with Beatrice, but for some time now I've been living with my painted pages and my thoughts of Demian in such an unreal world that I've completely lost sight and thoughts of her too. I could not have said a word to anyone about my dreams, my expectations, my inner transformation, even if I had wanted to. But how could I have wanted this?